The Librarian and the Lost Codex. Chapter 1. The Viscount and the Vanishing. The rain fell on London with a weary sort of determination, as if the sky itself had settled in for a good long cry. It streaked the mullioned windows of the Mayfair auction house, turning the gaslights on Bond Street into shimmering, indistinct pools of amber. Inside Beckett's, however, the weather was irrelevant. The air was warm, still, and thick with the scent of aged vellum, furniture polish, and the faint, hopeful perfume of money. This was a realm of permanence in a changing world, a mausoleum for beautiful things. Chloe Finch, senior librarian at Beckett's Rare Books and Manuscripts, often felt like a caretaker of the dead. She moved through the pre-auction hush with a reverence that bordered on the devotional, her fingers grazing the spine of a first-edition Milton, straightening the protective glass over a folio of Shakespeare's sonnets. Her world was one of meticulous order, of provenance, of chain of title, of the tiny, almost invisible details that separated a priceless artifact from a clever fake. At 32, she was considered young for her level of expertise, a fact she attributed to a childhood spent in her father's dusty, cathedral-like second-hand bookshop rather than any particular genius. Her knowledge was earned, not inherited, and it gave her a quiet, unshakable confidence that was often mistaken for shyness. Tonight, her focus was entirely on Lot 107, the Codex Veritas. It rested on a velvet cushion within a climate-controlled display case, its leather binding scarred by centuries, its brass clasps tarnished to a soft celadon green. A single angled beam of light illuminated its ancient surface. To the casual observer, it was an ugly, unremarkable object. To Chloe, it was a symphony. A late 14th century English manuscript, it was a collection of monastic accounts, land grants, and ecclesiastical letters. Its true value, as detailed in the Huhude auction catalogue, lay not in its literary merit, but in its potential historical impact. Hidden within its dense Latin and crabbed marginalia was said to be a unique cipher, a key used by a long-forgotten abbot to encode the true boundaries of the abbey's vast, and now disputed, landholdings. The codex was, in essence, a legal weapon wrapped in vellum. The sale had already generated a quiet storm of interest. Chloe had fielded inquiries from historians, from university libraries, and from the private solicitors of several old families whose titles might be affected by the codex's contents. But two potential buyers had emerged as the frontrunners. The first was a representative of the Marquess of Ashworth, a man whose fortune was built on coal and whose lands were rumoured to be directly adjacent to the old monastic properties. He was a new money aristocrat, all Polish and politesse, but Chloe sensed a ruthless pragmatism beneath the surface. The second was the one who gave her pause. He was there tonight, standing before the display case, his tall, lean frame casting a long shadow in the low light. He wore a simple, well-tailored black coat and held a pair of white gloves in one hand. He hadn't moved for several minutes. This was Viscount Motton, Theodore Theo Ashworth to his friends, if he had any. No relation to the Marquess. The papers, if they ever deigned to notice him, would have called him elusive. The Ton, in its endless gossip, had long since dismissed him as eccentric and moved on. He was a scholar, a collector, and a man so notoriously reclusive that his presence at a public auction was a minor sensation in itself. Chloe knew his face, not from society pages, but from the meticulous records of buyers she kept in her ledger. Lord Motton was a regular though remote client. He purchased selectively obscure theological tracts, early works on English common law, monastic cartularies. He never haggled, never made a fuss, and always had his purchases delivered to his family seat, Blackwood Park in Kent. He was, in Chloe's professional opinion, the perfect sort of collector, passionate, knowledgeable, and discreet. Sensing her gaze, he looked up. His eyes were a startling, intelligent grey, and they held none of the guarded arrogance she often saw in men of his station. Instead, there was a deep-seated curiosity, a look of genuine interest that was both disarming and intense. "Miss Finch," he said, his voice a low, quiet tenor that suited the hush of the room perfectly. "I was hoping you might be on duty tonight. I have a question about the Codex, and I trust your opinion above the catalogue's prose." Chloe felt a faint, unexpected warmth creep up her neck. "Lord Motton. Of course. What is your question?" He gestured towards the display. "The catalogue mentions a cipher, a unique method of encoding land boundaries within the text, but it's vague on the mechanism. Is it a simple substitution cipher, or something more complex? A steganographic technique, perhaps, hiding the information in the illumination or the line spacing?" It was a deeply insightful question, one that betrayed hours of his own research and thought. "You are quite correct to ask," she replied, stepping closer to the case. He smelled of rain, old books, and something clean and herbal, like rosemary. The Abbey's abbot at the time was known to be a former student of Roger Bacon. The cipher isn't in the text itself. Our preliminary analysis, which we've kept discreet to maintain the lot's value, suggests the key is in the marginalia. Certain letters are formed with a slightly heavier stroke. When isolated, they form a second, hidden layer of text. It's crude but effective. Without the key, it's just a book of accounts. A flicker of intense excitement lit his grey eyes before being quickly suppressed. "Bacon's teachings on optics and the obfuscation of knowledge," he murmured, almost to himself. "Fascinating. You see, Miss Finch, if the boundaries it describes align with the old de Verdon estate—" He trailed off, as if catching himself revealing too much. "Never mind. Thank you. Your expertise is, as always, invaluable." He gave her a small formal bow and melted back into the shadows of the auction house. Chloe watched him go, a strange sense of loss settling in her chest. It was the same feeling she got when she had to return a particularly good book to the stacks. An encounter with something rare and brilliant, now over. The auction was scheduled for the following evening. The plan was simple. A final night of security, the sale, and then the Codex would be on its way to its new owner, and Chloe could return to the comforting, predictable world of cataloguing. She was in her small, cluttered office just after midnight, finishing the final condition report when the silence was shattered. It wasn't a loud noise, but an absence of one. The subtle hum of the climate control system died, plunging the room into an abrupt, unnerving quiet. A second later, the emergency generator kicked in, but the lights only flickered back to half strength, casting long, distorting shadows. Chloe's heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed a heavy brass paperweight and crept out into the main gallery. The air was cold, the temperature already starting to rise without the climate control. She moved towards the case holding the Codex, her footsteps sounding like cannon shots on the wooden floor. The case was intact, the Codex still resting on its velvet pillow. She let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Then she saw it. A faint, dark smudge on the brass lock of the case. She knelt, her trained eye taking over from her fear. It wasn't a smudge. It was a fine black powder. Lock-picking residue. Her gaze shot to the Codex. It looked the same. But something was wrong. The angle of the light on the vellum was slightly different. She peered closer, her blood running cold. The Codex was a fake. A brilliant, professional fake. The brass clasps were slightly too shiny, the leather too uniformly aged. The true soul of the artifact, the weight of centuries, was gone. The Codex Veritas had been stolen, and in its place, a ghost had been left behind. The police were called, of course. A Dar inspector from Scotland Yard, a man named Thorne, who looked at rare books the way a butcher might look at a living cow, took charge. He asked Chloe the same questions a dozen times. Who had access? Who showed unusual interest? She mentioned the Marquis's agent, the other bidders, and finally, reluctantly, Lord Motton. Viscount Motton, Thorne said, scribbling in his notebook with a pencil stub. The recluse, the one with the library the size of a cathedral. I've heard of him. Spends more time with his books than with people. My wife reads those romance novels. Says he's dreamy. He snorted. Seems the kind who might want something badly enough to acquire it by other means. No respect for the law, these high-born types. Think they're above it. It's not like that, Chloe said, too quickly, too forcefully. He's a scholar. He has a profound respect for the artifacts. He wouldn't he, Miss Finch? Thorne interrupted, a cynical glint in his eye. You'd be surprised what people will do for the things they love. He was here tonight. He asked pointed questions about its security. He knew its value better than anyone. And now it's gone. It's a neat little circle, isn't it? The next morning, the news was everywhere. Rare Codex stolen in Mayfair heist. Viscount questioned in rare book theft. The Ton, always hungry for a scandal involving one of its own, feasted. The whispers painted Lord Motton not as an eccentric scholar, but as a deranged obsessive, a man who would steal to satisfy his craving. His name, once whispered with mild curiosity, was now spoken with a salacious thrill. Chloe stood in the wreckage of her quiet life, staring at the facsimile codex, a perfect lie. She knew what the evidence suggested. She knew what Inspector Thorne believed. But as she looked at the flawless, soulless forgery, she couldn't shake the image of those honest, intelligent grey eyes, alight with passion for a mystery, not for possession. The official story was too neat, too simple, and in Chloe's experience, the simple answer was almost always a fiction. Chapter 2. The shadows in the margins. The scandal broke over the Viscount like a wave over a solitary rock, leaving him drenched but unmoved. While the newspapers sold copies with lurid headlines and the clubs buzzed with self-righteous indignation, Lord Motton remained at Blackwood Park, seemingly oblivious. Chloe, however, could not be so detached. She had watched the accusation form in Inspector Thorne's mind, had seen the satisfying click as he fit the pieces of his flimsy puzzle together. It felt like a personal failure. She had spent her life learning to read the subtle truths of inanimate objects, the way a binding could tell you about its maker, the way an inscription could reveal a relationship. She had misread a man, and that man was now being pilloried for a crime she was increasingly certain he did not commit. Her certainty was born not of intuition, but of a quiet, 2-day investigation of her own. While the police focused on motive and opportunity, Chloe focused on the object itself. She spent hours with the forged codex left behind, comparing it under strong light to photographs of the original. The forger was brilliant, but he was not a time traveller. Under a magnifying lens, she found a single crucial flaw. A tiny, almost microscopic fragment of modern machine-made paper, dyed and treated to look old, had been caught in the hinge of one of the brass clasps. The original codex, with its handmade paper, could never have produced such a fragment. The thief had created the duplicate in a modern workshop, not a medieval scriptorium. Armed with this small, solid truth, she requested a leave of absence from Beckett's. The management, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, granted it with almost unseemly haste. A week after the theft, Chloe Finch found herself on a train bound for Kent, the tiny paper fragment safe in a velvet pouch in her reticule. She was going to see the monster of Blackwood Park. Blackwood Park was not the forbidding Gothic fortress she had half imagined. It was a beautiful, rambling Elizabethan manor of mellow red brick and twisted chimneys, nestled in a valley of ancient oaks. The gravel crunched under her feet as she approached the heavy oak door, her resolve feeling far less solid than the ground beneath her. A stern-faced butler answered, his expression a masterpiece of disapproval. "Lord Motton is not receiving visitors," he intoned, as if announcing a royal decree. "Please," Chloe said, her voice firmer than she felt, "tell him it's Chloe Finch, from Beckett's. It's about the Codex." The butler hesitated, then closed the door, leaving her standing on the step in a cold wind. Several long minutes passed. She was about to turn away, convinced she had made a terrible miscalculation, when the door swung open again. The butler's face was, if anything, even more stony. This way. She was led through a cavernous great hall, past suits of armour that seemed to watch her with empty eyes, and into a library. It was, without question, the most magnificent room she had ever seen. It was 2 stories high, with a curved gallery running along the upper level. Ladders on brass rails leaned against shelves crammed with thousands of books. A huge stone fireplace crackled with a welcoming fire, and in a large leather armchair beside it, looking smaller and more fragile than she remembered, sat Viscount Motton. He rose as she entered. He looked tired, the skin under his grey eyes smudged with shadows, but his gaze was as direct and intelligent as ever. "Miss Finch," he said, his voice quiet. "This is unexpected. My butler, Henderson, informs me that I am not to trust anyone from London, especially journalists in disguise. You are not a journalist, I hope." "No, my lord," Chloe said, her professional composure returning. "I am a librarian, and I am here because the police are wrong." A flicker of something, surprise, hope, wariness, crossed his face. He gestured to a chair opposite his own. "Please sit. Henderson, we'll need tea, and perhaps some of Cook's seed cake. Miss Finch looks as though she's travelled a long way." As they waited for the tea, a silence settled between them. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but the quiet of 2 people who were more accustomed to the company of books than of crowds. Chloe used the time to study the room. On a large central table, surrounded by open volumes and sheets of notes, lay a large, detailed map of the local countryside, marked with ancient boundaries in faded ink. Henderson arrived with the tea, and after he had gone, Chloe spoke. "The evidence they have against you is purely circumstantial. You were there, you were interested, you have the means and the knowledge. It's a story that writes itself." "And it is a very popular story, it seems," Theo said dryly, handing her a cup of tea. "I have been tried and convicted in every drawing room in London." "But the story is missing a crucial detail," Chloe said, setting down her cup and reaching for her reticule. She carefully removed the velvet pouch and extracted the tiny paper fragment. She handed it to him. "I found this caught in the clasp of the forgery." Theo took the fragment, holding it up to the light from the window. He moved to the table and pulled a large magnifying glass from a drawer. He studied it for a long moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Machine-made," he murmured, echoing her own conclusion. "Late 19th century at the earliest, possibly even newer. It's a wood pulp paper, nothing like the linen rag stock of the 14th century. He looked up at her, a new light in his eyes. "You found this? You came here to tell me this?" "I came here because I know you didn't steal it," Chloe said simply. "A man capable of this forgery," she gestured to the fragment, "is a craftsman, a technician. The theft was bold, almost theatrical. It doesn't fit." Theo sank into the chair opposite her, running a hand through his already dishevelled hair. "You are perhaps the only person in England who thinks so, besides my grandmother." He smiled, a brief, sad smile. "Thank you." "But that's not all," Chloe continued, her librarian's mind now fully engaged. "This fragment is a clue. It's a piece of the forger's world. We need to find out where it came from. And you," she said, looking pointedly at the map on his table, "you have another reason for wanting the Codex back, don't you? It's not just about the object." Theo followed her gaze to the map. He sighed, a long, weary sound. "You are as perceptive as you are kind, Miss Finch. The Codex isn't just a historical curiosity to me. It's personal." He rose and walked to the map, tracing a faint line with his finger. "My family, the Ashworths of Blackwood, have held this land since the Norman conquest. but our title to a large portion of it, the western woods and the valley beyond, has always been contested. There were lawsuits a century ago, compromises made, boundaries shifted. My father, before he died, became obsessed with proving our original claim. He believed the key lay in the records of the old abbey that once owned this whole valley, the abbey that produced the Codex Veritas. Chloe joined him at the map, the pieces falling into place. The hidden cipher. You think it contains the original, unaltered boundaries of the abbey's land. Your family's land. I know it does, Theo said quietly. I've spent 5 years tracing the abbey's history, matching its records with the Domesday Book and other early surveys. The Codex is the final piece. It will prove that the land taken from my family by a corrupt local magistrate in the 18th century was done so illegally. It's not about the money, Miss Finch. It's about justice. It's about my father's dying wish. He turned to her, his grey eyes filled with a desperate vulnerability. And now you see the full picture. The man who had the most to gain from the Codex's contents, a motive far stronger than simple greed. I look guiltier than ever. Chloe looked from the map to the paper fragment in his hand and back again. She saw not a thief, but a man fighting a shadowy, centuries-old battle with the only weapons he had, his mind and his heritage. Then we have 2 puzzles to solve, my lord, she said, her voice filled with a quiet determination that surprised even herself. The mystery of a stolen manuscript and the truth of your family's history. And I believe they are one and the same. We need to find the forger. That's where your investigation and mine must begin. For the first time since she had arrived, a genuine smile touched Theo's lips. We, Miss Finch? You would risk your career, your reputation, on the word of a suspected thief. I would risk it on the evidence, she corrected him gently, and on my own judgment. Now, she said, her tone becoming brisk and professional, a forger of this quality would need a workshop, specialized tools, and a knowledge of antiquarian papers and inks. He wouldn't be operating out of a garret. He would be connected to the trade, perhaps a bookbinder, a restorer, or even a dealer. She looked at him. Do you know anyone who fits that description? Theo's eyes narrowed in thought. He walked back to his desk and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. I keep records of every dealer and restorer I've ever dealt with. There's one name, a man in Holborn, Silas Vestry. He's a bookbinder and restorer, highly skilled. He's done work for me in the past, exquisite work. But he was always secretive about his methods, and he was curiously interested in my research into the Abbey. He asked questions a little too eagerly about what I hoped to find in the old records. The paper fragment, Chloe said, her heart beginning to beat faster. Could it have come from his workshop? It's a place to start, Theo agreed. He looked at her, a new resolve hardening his features. But if we're to do this, Miss Finch, we do it properly. No more formalities. My name is Theo, and I have a feeling we are about to become partners in a very dangerous game. He extended his hand. After a heartbeat's hesitation, Chloe took it. His grip was warm and firm. Chloe, she said. And in the firelit library of Blackwood Park, with the ghosts of centuries watching from the shelves, an unlikely alliance was forged. Chapter 3. The Secrets of the Scriptorium. The address in Holborn led them not to a workshop, but to a deceptive facade. Number 7, Cinder Lane, was a narrow, soot-blackened building sandwiched between a tallow chandler's and a print shop. A small hand-painted sign above the door read, S. Vestry, Bookbinder and Restorer. It looked humble, almost shabby, the perfect camouflage for a man who dealt in shadows. They had decided to approach openly. Theo, using his title and reputation as a collector, would commission a piece of work. It was a simple plan, but as Chloe had learned, the simplest lies were often the most effective. She accompanied him as his librarian, a role that required no acting on her part. The door opened onto a small, cluttered shop. The air was thick with the scent of hide glue, old leather, and solvents. Shelves were crammed with books in various states of decay, spines hanging loose, boards detached, pages crumbling. A stooped man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched on a thin nose looked up from a workbench covered in tools. This was Silas Vestry. He was unremarkable in every way, a grey ghost of a man who would never be noticed in a crowd. But his eyes, small and dark, were unnervingly sharp. "Lord Motton," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "An honour. I read of your difficulties. I trust you are well?" "Well enough, Vestry," Theo replied smoothly. "I have a new commission, a family Bible, early 17th century. The binding is beyond repair. I need a new one in period style. Calf over oak boards, blind-tooled. Can you do it?" Vestry's eyes flickered to Chloe, then back to Theo. "Of course, my lord. My work is the best in London, as you know." He gestured to a shelf behind him. "I have samples of my tooling. Perhaps your assistant would care to examine them." It was a test. Chloe moved forward, her heart pounding, and began to inspect the samples. The tooling was indeed exquisite, perfectly imitating the geometric patterns of the 17th century. She ran her fingers over the leather, feeling for any anomaly, and then she saw it. On the inside of one sample, a small paper label with a manufacturer's mark. It was a distinctive watermark, a crowned fleur-de-lis. She filed the image away in her mind. As Theo discussed prices and delivery dates with Vestry, Chloe's gaze swept the workshop. Her eyes landed on a small waste bin in the corner. Amidst the leather scraps and trimmings, she saw a small pile of paper offcuts. The paper was a creamy white, machine-made. It looked identical to the fragment she had found in the forged Codex. She caught Theo's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod. He understood. "I think we understand each other, Vestry," Theo said, his tone hardening slightly. "But there is one more thing. I'm also looking for a specific type of paper for another project. An antique finish. Do you have anything like that?" He gestured to the waste bin. "Those scraps, for instance. May I?" Without waiting for permission, Theo moved towards the bin. Vestry's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of alarm. "It's just rubbish, my lord. Nothing of interest." But Theo had already picked up a handful of the offcuts. He examined them, then handed one to Chloe. She didn't need her magnifying glass. It was a perfect match. She looked at Vestry, her professional respect for his skill now replaced by a cold disdain. "This paper, Mr. Vestry, it's a modern, machine-made stock. Where do you acquire it?" Vestry's eyes darted between them, the avarice fading, replaced by a guarded fear. I have a supplier. For restoration work, you understand. Sometimes old books need new end papers. It's perfectly legitimate." "The Codex Veritas," Chloe said quietly, her voice cutting through the dusty air. "The forgery you left in its place. A tiny piece of this paper was caught in the clasp. It was your calling card." The colour drained from Vestry's face. He took a step back, knocking against his workbench. "I don't know what you're talking about. You have no proof. I'm a simple craftsman. Now, I must ask you to leave." "We will leave," Theo said, his voice cold as steel. "But we will be back. And when we return, it will be with Inspector Thorne and a warrant. You have tonight to consider your position. If you cooperate, if you tell us who paid you to create that forgery, your part in this may be seen as the work of a craftsman following orders. If you do not, you will hang as a principal thief." It was a bluff, a magnificent, dangerous bluff. They had no proof that would stand up in court and no influence with Inspector Thorne, but the threat, delivered with the full weight of Theo's aristocratic bearing, was enough. Vestry crumbled. "Wait," he whispered, his voice cracking. He glanced towards the back of the shop, towards a curtained doorway. "It wasn't my idea. I was paid well. A man came to me, a gentleman. He had the original Codex with him, just for a few hours. He wanted a duplicate, a perfect one. He provided the materials, the old leather, the brass. I just put it together. Who was he? Chloe demanded. I don't know his name. He never gave it, but he was familiar. I'd seen him before, at auctions. He worked for a collector, a powerful one. Vestry swallowed hard. He had a signet ring. I saw it when he paid me, a griffin rampant, and a motto, vis et honor, strength and honor. Theo went rigid beside Chloe. She felt the tension shoot through his frame. The Marquis of Ashworth, he breathed, our distant cousin, his family crest. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. The Marquis, whose lands bordered the disputed territory, the Marquis, who stood to lose a fortune if the Codex's true boundaries were revealed. He hadn't stolen the Codex to possess it. He had stolen it to destroy it, to suppress the truth it contained. He had framed Theo, the man with the clearest motive, to divert suspicion from himself. As they stood in the stunned silence of the workshop, a sound came from behind the curtained doorway, a faint scuffle, a muffled curse. Before either of them could react, the curtain was ripped aside. A large, brutish man stood there, his face a mask of anger. In his hands he held a heavy iron binding press. You bloody fool, Vestry, the man snarled. The Marquis will hear of this. He lunged. Theo shoved Chloe aside, and the heavy press crashed into a shelf, sending a cascade of books and tools to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Theo, despite his scholarly demeanour, fought with a desperate, feral strength, grappling with the larger man. Chloe, her heart in her throat, looked around for a weapon. Her hand closed around a heavy bone folder on Vestry's bench. She swung it with all her might, catching the brutish man on the side of the head. He bellowed in pain and surprise, his grip on Theo loosening. It was all the opening Theo needed. He landed a solid punch to the man's jaw, sending him stumbling back through the curtain, where he crashed into unseen objects with a thunderous noise. Run! Theo shouted, grabbing Chloe's hand. They fled the shop, bursting out into the cold night air of Cinder Lane, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. They didn't stop running until they had lost themselves in the warren of alleys and streets, finally emerging, breathless and dishevelled, onto the relative safety of Holborn's main thoroughfare. Leaning against a lamppost, trying to catch his breath, Theo looked at Chloe. A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face. You, he panted, just attacked a man with a bone folder, a tool for folding paper. Chloe, her own breath ragged, started to laugh. It was a shaky, hysterical laugh, born of fear and relief and the sheer absurdity of the situation. It was the only weapon at hand, she managed to gasp, standing there in the gaslight, filthy and frightened but very much alive, the barriers of formality between them dissolved completely. They weren't a viscount and a librarian anymore. They were two people who had just risked their lives for the truth. And in that moment, Theo looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not an employee or an accomplice, but a partner, an equal. We have him, Chloe, he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. We have the proof. Vestry will talk now, if only to save himself. The Marquis's man was there. We have witnesses. We have the paper trail. He took her hand, the one still clutching the bone folder, and gently pried it from her grip. You did this. You believed in me when no one else would. The intensity in his grey eyes was no longer about the Codex or the land or his father's legacy. It was about her. Chloe felt her breath catch in her throat, the cold night air, the distant sound of traffic. The whole world seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them on the rain-slicked street. Chapter 4. The Truth in the Telling. The arrest of the Marquis of Ashworth was a sensation that eclipsed even the original theft. Inspector Thorne, presented with Vestry's full confession, secured, it must be said, with a great deal more finesse by Theo and Chloe than by any threat of police procedure, had no choice but to act. The Marquess's man, a discharged soldier named Cribb, was picked up trying to flee to the continent and quickly implicated his master. The Codex Veritas was found in a concealed safe in the Marquess's London home, along with a collection of other antiquities whose provenance was, to say the least, questionable. The story of a jealous nobleman stealing a manuscript to frame a rival and destroy a truth that threatened his fortune captivated the public. Theo was exonerated in the papers with the same fervour with which he had been condemned. But for Chloe and Theo, the public vindication, while satisfying, was merely a footnote. The real story, their story, was written in the quiet hours they spent together in the days that followed. Theo returned to Blackwood Park, and Chloe, on an extended leave from Beckett's, was a constant visitor. They pored over the recovered codex in his library, the winter sunlight streaming through the tall windows. With the cipher key now fully revealed, they worked side by side to decode the abbot's hidden text. It was painstaking work. Each marginal letter had to be isolated, transcribed, and then reassembled into a coherent narrative. They worked in a companionable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire or the soft rustle of pages. Sometimes Theo would read a particularly dense passage aloud, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Sometimes Chloe would lean over his shoulder to point out a faint marking he had missed, her hand briefly brushing his. These small, accidental touches became charged with a new, unspoken awareness. The partnership forged in danger was deepening into something far more profound. One evening, a week after the Marquess's arrest, they finally pieced together the last section of the cipher. The complete text of the decoded boundaries lay before them on the map table, a series of precise geographical descriptions written in a mixture of Latin and Old English. Theo traced the lines on the modern map with a trembling finger. The Abbey's land, and therefore his family's original claim, extended deep into the valley, encompassing the very woods and farms that had been lost in the 18th century. "It's here," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "All of it. The old mill, the grazing lands, the ironwood forest. My father was right. He was right all along." Chloe stood beside him, looking at the map, at the physical proof of a centuries-old truth. She felt a profound sense of satisfaction, not just for Theo, but for the Codex itself. It had fulfilled its purpose, its secrets had been heard. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. Theo was quiet for a long moment. He looked from the map to her. The firelight danced in his grey eyes. "The law is on my side," he said. "But I will not use this to strip families from their homes, Chloe. The people who live on that land now, they've farmed it for generations. They had no part in the old corruption." He straightened up, a new sense of purpose in his bearing. "I will use it to right a wrong, but not to create new ones. The leases will be honoured. The tenants will be offered fair terms, security they've never had. It's about justice, not revenge. My father would understand." Chloe looked at him, and in that moment, she saw the full measure of the man. He was not just a scholar or a recluse. He was a man of principle, of deep and abiding honour. The quietude she had always sensed in him was not emptiness, but a profound stillness, a depth of character that the shallow waters of society could never fathom. "Theo," she began, but the words caught in her throat. He turned to her fully, taking both her hands in his. His touch was warm, reassuring. "I could not have done any of this without you, Chloe. You saw past the scandal, past the suspicion. You saw me. No one has ever done that before." His gaze held hers, and she felt herself drowning in the gentle grey of his eyes. "I saw a man who loved books for the right reasons," she whispered. "A man with a kind heart and a brilliant mind. It wasn't difficult." He lifted one hand and gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her cheek. The touch sent a shiver through her. "I have spent my life in the company of the dead," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I never expected to find someone so vibrantly, so beautifully alive, and certainly not in the quiet stacks of an auction house." Chloe's heart was pounding so hard, she was sure he must feel it through their joined hands. "Neither did I," she confessed. "I thought my life was in the margins, in the details. You showed me that the real story is the one we live, not just the one we read." He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. When his lips met hers, it was as gentle and profound as the turning of a page, a promise of new beginnings written in the oldest language of all. The fire crackled softly, the books stood silent, witness on their shelves, and for the first time, Blackwood Park felt not like a mausoleum, but like a home. The story of the Codex Veritas did not end with a kiss, of course. The legal battles over the land took months, then years. Theo, guided by his principles and with Chloe by his side, navigated the complex world of property law with patience and integrity. He became a different kind of lord, not a distant landlord, but a present and just one. He used his newfound wealth to restore the ancient woodland, to improve the farms, and to establish a school on his estate. And Chloe? She never did return to Beckett's. Her new position was far more challenging and far more rewarding. She became the custodian of the Blackwood Park Library, a task that would take a lifetime. But more than that, she became Theo's partner in every sense. They married in a small, quiet ceremony in the ancient stone church that stood on the edge of his property, the very church that had once belonged to the abbey that produced the Codex. The vicar, an old family friend, beamed at them. Henderson, the butler, managed something that might, in a certain light, be interpreted as a smile. The Codex Veritas itself was eventually donated to the British Museum, where it could be studied by scholars from around the world. Theo insisted on a small, discreet placard that mentioned its role in righting a centuries-old wrong. Chloe had helped him write the text. On a spring afternoon, a year after their wedding, Chloe sat at the great table in the library, cataloguing a new acquisition, a collection of 16th-century poetry. Sunlight streamed through the windows, warming the leather and paper. Theo was across from her, working on a paper about the Abbey's history for a historical journal. He looked up, caught her eye, and smiled, a private, warm smile meant only for her. Chloe smiled back, then returned to her work. The quiet rustle of pages filled the room. In the margins of her life, where she had once expected only silence and solitude, she had found a story richer than any she had ever catalogued. And it was still being written. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette and tap